The badge clattered against Rachel Torres's chest the moment she clocked in. 23 years of military nursing, compressed into 6 weeks of temp agency paperwork, all of it freshly printed and unsigned by anyone who actually remembered her name. She'd survived Sangin by keeping her head down. She'd survived Sacred Heart Hospital the same way. The ICU at Sacred Heart smelled like antiseptic and ozone, that sharp chemical tang that comes after a defibrillator fires. Rachel moved through it like she was navigating a minefield, because every corridor felt like one. Beds lined the walls in precise intervals. Monitors beeped their mechanical psalms. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made her jaw clench, a sound she'd learned to tune out in field hospitals where fluorescence didn't exist and dying happened in darkness. She'd been assigned to trauma recovery, which was both mercy and torture. 4th Wing, 3rd Shift, minimal supervision. Exactly what she'd requested. The other nurses barely acknowledged her beyond the obligatory nod. She was the temp, the placeholder, the one who'd disappear when the overtime ended. Perfect. Invisibility was her native language. Her hands moved across the crash cart with military precision, each item placed at exact 90-degree angles. Ambubag. Laryngeal blade. Defibrillator pads in their sealed packets. The movements were automatic, born from 3 tours and 2,000 trauma scenarios she wasn't supposed to remember. A senior nurse named Margot glanced over from the charting station, her eyes tracking Rachel's unusual speed with arterial line placement. "You've done this before," Margot said. "Not a question." "Once or twice," Rachel replied, maintaining the thin smile that had become her armor. The lie was practiced, effortless. She tucked the dog tag back beneath her scrubs where it belonged, where it couldn't catch light and ask questions. Margot nodded and returned to her charts. That was the thing about people, they wanted to believe the surface story. They didn't want to know the history beneath the resume gap. They didn't want to know where scars came from or why certain sounds made your nervous system go rigid or why you could start and fall in complete darkness with muscle memory alone. Rachel had been officially erased 2 years ago from every database that mattered. Her service file was locked behind 72 levels of classification. Her medals were in a vault at the Pentagon, sealed in a box with her name redacted from every citation. Major Rachel Torres, call sign Reaper, didn't exist anymore. The woman pushing the crash cart through Jacksonville's Sacred Heart Hospital was just a temp with excellent technique and zero personal history. The first real test came at 2:13 a.m. Room 412's monitor started its distress song, a frantic rhythm that meant ventricular fibrillation, the heart in chaos, abandoning its job, essentially committing suicide in real time. The attending physician was 3 floors down. The resident was with another patient. The nursing station had 4 people, all turning simultaneously at the alarm, all calculating who was closest to respond. Rachel was already moving. She reached the room in 12 strides, her gait favoring her left leg just slightly, a limp from a femoral fracture that had never fully healed because she'd never had time for physical therapy when operating in war zones. The patient was a 64-year-old man post-bypass surgery, his chest already cracking at the sternum. His wife was screaming. The monitors painted the ugliest picture, flat line across everything that mattered. "Call the code," Rachel said. Her voice had dropped an octave without her permission, the command voice that came from somewhere deep and trained. The senior resident appeared in the doorway, already reaching for the code cart, already assessing. Rachel was already moving the overbed table, already positioning the defibrillator pads with the muscle memory of someone who'd applied them on dirt and blood and screaming soldiers who didn't have the luxury of a sterile ICU. "Charging to 200, she said. "Not requested." Stated as fact. The resident blinked. For exactly 1 second, there was confusion on his face. This temp nurse wasn't asking permission, wasn't deferring to his title, wasn't performing the standard script of emergency medicine as taught in academic institutions. She was doing what needed to be done with the absolute certainty of someone who'd done it 4,000 times before. "Clear," Rachel said, and the paddles came down, and the body arched, and the monitor went absolutely silent for the space of 3 heartbeats. Sinus rhythm. The heart had remembered its job. The wife was crying. The resident was running through compressions with better form after watching Rachel's technique. The crash team arrived 2 minutes later, unnecessary, finding a stable patient and an ICU nurse standing with her hands folded, her breathing controlled, her pulse completely normal. A senior cardiologist looked at her chart. Looked at Rachel. Said nothing. The moment passed like a door closing quietly. Margot found her 20 minutes later in the staff break room, standing at the window overlooking Jacksonville's wet pavement, rain hammering the glass like applause from someone who didn't understand the rules of discretion. That was extraordinary, Margot said carefully. That kind of response time. That kind of command. Where did you train? Community college, Rachel answered. The lie was smooth, practiced. Good program. Margot didn't push. People rarely did when they sensed they were being politely excluded. Rachel had learned early that vulnerability was something you performed for people you trusted, and she trusted approximately 0 people left alive. She went back to the ICU at 3:15 a.m. and found Dr. Ashford at the computer terminal, his fingers still hovering over the keyboard. His eyes were on the pharmacy access log. Specifically, on the line items showing Rachel's login, 2:11 a.m., restricted medication dispensation records, manual cross-reference query for possible discrepancies in opioid documentation. Their eyes met across 15 feet of humming fluorescent light. Dr. Ashford was in his early 50s, the kind of man whose power came not from medical competence but from institutional position, 15 years at Sacred Heart, a brother-in-law on the hospital board, enough social capital to make phone calls that mattered. He'd noticed the resume gap the moment her paperwork arrived. 6 years of employment history, then nothing, then suddenly a temp agency willing to place her. The credentials were legitimate. The certifications were current. But the timeline was wrong, and Dr. Ashford was the type of man who paid attention to things that didn't add up. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Rachel held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then returned to her charting as if the encounter hadn't happened. This was the rhythm they'd begin to dance. He'd noticed something. He didn't know what. And she had exactly 2 shifts before the next reveal. But that wasn't the worst part. As she documented the code blue at 3:36 a.m., logging every medication, every intervention, every split-second decision, Rachel's fingers froze over the keyboard. Room 412's chart showed the patient had received 2 separate doses of fentanyl in the hour before the arrest. One documented in the system. One that appeared nowhere in the medical record, but absolutely present in the man's bloodstream given his respiratory depression, his pupils. Someone had diverted a dose. Someone with pharmacy access. Someone who'd written it off the books and kept the rest of the supply. Rachel's jaw tightened. Her hands were completely still, not trembling, not reacting in any visible way. But her mind was cataloging, calculating. Room for 12 wasn't an accident. It was a symptom. And Dr. Ashford knew she'd just figured that out. He was watching from the nurse's station, pretending to review charts, his expression carefully neutral. She'd survived Sangin by identifying threats early. She'd survived 2 years of erasure by staying invisible. But now she was seeing something the hospital administration didn't know yet, a pattern in the pharmacy logs, a man with access and motive, a system that trusted credentials and positions more than it trusted the actual numbers. Margot appeared at her shoulder with 2 cups of coffee, the gesture of someone offering solidarity without requiring explanation. Second code in 1 week, same unit, Margot said quietly. Weird, right? Rachel took the coffee. Statistically possible. Yeah, but not likely. Margot's voice was careful, precise. If you see something else weird, let me know. I'm old enough that I trust my instincts more than my performance reviews. Rachel nodded. She understood what Margot wasn't saying directly, that an experienced nurse had already spotted something wrong, and was reaching out carefully to the temp nurse who'd moved like a soldier and responded like someone with authority that didn't come from any hospital credential. The shift ended at 7:22 a.m. Rachel clocked out and walked to her car through the parking garage, where the concrete air hung thick with diesel exhaust and wet asphalt. She sat with the engine dead for 6 minutes, running the pharmacy access numbers through her mind, comparing the discrepancies, remembering protocols she wasn't supposed to remember from a hospital that officially didn't exist. 2 years of invisibility had just become complicated. She'd seen something. Dr. Ashford knew she'd seen it. And the next move belonged to him. He saw her accessing the restricted pharmacy files at 11:38 p.m. on a Tuesday, her fingers moving through the system with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was searching for. Dr. Ashford had been standing in the darkened hallway outside the ICU, watching through the glass partition, his mind already assembling the pieces. A temp nurse with credentials that looked freshly printed. A 2-year gap in her resume that she deflected with vague mentions of family issues. And now this, her hand steady on a keyboard, pulling up medication discrepancies that should have been invisible to someone without hospital administration clearance. He waited until her shift ended, then cornered her outside the ICU on her 3rd week, his voice low and venomous in the empty corridor. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a clinical white that erased all mercy from his face. I saw you access restricted patient files. His words came measured, deliberate, like a surgeon making an incision. And unless you want me digging into why your credentials look freshly printed, you'll keep your mouth shut about the medication discrepancies. He leaned closer, his cologne expensive and suffocating, his eyes the color of a shark's, all hunger, no reflection. Do you understand what I'm saying? Rachel stood motionless, her scrub still damp from a 12-hour shift, her hands at her sides. She took one measured breath through her nose. At the corner of her right eye, a single tear formed, not from fear, but from the weight of 2 years of silence finally pressing against her composure. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her voice when it came utterly calm, like someone stating a fact that had already been decided. You're making a mistake. Ashford's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to temp nurses speaking to him in complete sentences, let alone with that tone, that flat, unaffected tone that suggested she'd already calculated the cost of his threats and found them manageable. He straightened, his shadow stretching across the tile floor like a prediction. Temp nurses follow orders, Torres. They don't make accusations. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of someone who believed power was measured in titles and connections, not in the ability to stay calm when the walls were closing in. 2 days later, the first public humiliation arrived during morning rounds. The overhead speakers crackled to life with the kind of announcement designed to carry across every corridor, every patient room, every corner of Sacred Heart Hospital. Temp Nurse Torres to the nurses' station. Temp Nurse Torres. Report to the nurses' station immediately. The word attempt echoed like a slur, stretched out like an insult. 20 heads turned on the 3rd floor medical ward. A resident smirked. A senior nurse exchanged a glance with an attending physician. Rachel was standing at the medication cart when the page came through, her hands arranging 4 bags with the same mechanical precision she'd maintained for 2 decades in field hospitals across 3 continents. She walked the corridor slowly, her limp barely visible. The injury from Sangin had healed into something that only showed when she was exhausted, and she was always exhausted now. Every eye followed her progress down the hallway. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their subtle satisfaction at seeing someone put in their place. The nurse's station was empty when she arrived. Ashford stood behind the desk, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, still, deceptive in its quietness, capable of crushing everything in its path. You're on bedpan duty starting this evening, he said, not looking up from his paperwork. The geriatric floor. I think that matches your capabilities more appropriately. Several staff members had paused nearby, pretending to review charts, actually listening. Rachel didn't respond. She simply turned and walked back to her station, her face composed, her breathing steady, her interior response locked away behind a door that required a code to open. The second attack came on a night shift, in the supply closet where the 4 lines and catheters were stored. Rachel was reaching for a box of 18-gauge needles when Ashford blocked the doorway, his silhouette filling the narrow space like a threat taking physical form. The smell of antiseptic and rubber tubing suddenly felt suffocating. "I've made calls," he said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than anger, something closer to certainty. "Hospital administrators in Tampa, Miami, Orlando. One word from me and you're blacklisted from every facility in Florida. You understand what temp means? It means disposable. It means I can erase you." His hands were clenched at his sides, and Rachel noticed he was breathing harder than the situation warranted. He needed her to react, needed to see fear, to see the collapse of her composure. Rachel's hands didn't shake as she held the cardboard box of supplies. Her pulse remained steady in her wrist, her vision clear. One tear escaped without permission, sliding down her cheek with the inevitability of water finding its level. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her eyes never wavering from his. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "You're making a mistake." The certainty in those 5 words, not a denial, not a plea, just a statement of fact, made something flicker behind Ashford's eyes. Fear, maybe. Or recognition that he'd misjudged who he was standing across from. He laughed, a sharp bark of sound that echoed off the metal shelving units. "Keep telling yourself that, temp." But he moved aside, and Rachel walked out of the supply closet carrying both the box and the weight of his confusion. That was the real power in her composure, not that it protected her, but that it broke the narrative he'd constructed. He needed her to be frightened. Her refusal to perform fear was itself a kind of warfare. The third humiliation was calculated for maximum damage. It came during shift change in the parking lot outside Sacred Heart, when the evening staff were transitioning to night shift and the day nurses were heading home, tired and vulnerable to distraction. 20 staff members walked toward their cars, their scrubs still damp, their minds already half gone to dinner plans and exhaustion. Ashford's voice carried across the asphalt like artillery fire. "Torres. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to bedpan duty on the geriatric floor. Perhaps that matches your skill level better." His words were loud enough for every person in a 50-foot radius to hear. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the nervous laughter, the kind people make when they're grateful they're not the target. Rachel stood beside her decade-old Honda Civic, the paint faded from years of sun and salt air from the nearby coast. She took one measured breath through her nose, her hand steady at her sides. At the corner of her right eye, a single tear formed again, not from humiliation, but from the effort of maintaining a structure that was never meant to be permanent. She wiped it away, her eyes meeting Ashford's across the parking lot with the kind of direct contact that made him look away first. "You're making a mistake," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it across the distance. Then she got into her car and drove home in silence, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing controlled, her mind already compartmentalizing the attack into a file labeled manageable. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next changed everything. The trauma alert came on a Tuesday morning when Rachel was restocking the supply room on the 2nd floor, folding trauma packs with the methodical precision of someone who'd assembled them in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled hospital. The intercom crackled, "Trauma alert. Incoming level 1. Training accident. ETA 3 minutes." Her body moved instinctively toward the emergency department, then stopped. She was on bedpan duty. This wasn't her place anymore. Ashford had made that abundantly clear. But then she saw the ambulance bay from a side window, saw the paramedics rushing from the doors with a stretcher carrying a man in combat fatigue soaked crimson with blood. A green beret, she recognized the tab on his shoulder even from a distance. The arterial spray pattern was visible from 30 feet away, a pattern she'd learned to read in tents and makeshift aid stations across Sangin. The combat tourniquet on his thigh was applied wrong, too low on the leg, the pressure insufficient. She could calculate his blood loss rate with the kind of accuracy that came from muscle memory, for minutes until cardiac arrest at this rate of bleeding. The emergency department erupted into controlled chaos, but Rachel could hear the hesitation in the organized panic. The attending physician's movements were competent but careful, lacking the decisiveness of someone who'd made these decisions under fire. Rachel moved through the corridors toward the trauma bay, her limp barely visible beneath her stride. No one stopped her. A temp nurse was invisible, after all. She was standing at the entrance to Trauma Bay 1 when the colonel's heart stopped. The monitor flatlined. His sinus rhythm dissolved into asystole, a perfectly flat line that meant death was measuring its approach in seconds. The surgical team froze for the briefest moment, that 1-second hesitation that separates survival from catastrophe. Dr. Ashford was in a meeting on the 4th floor. The attending physician looked at the residents around him, trying to make a decision while watching someone die. Rachel's body moved before her mind caught up, pushing through the paralyzed surgical team toward the patient. Her voice emerged in a command tone that made every person in the trauma bay snap to attention like they'd been struck. Scalpel. Rib spreaders. Blood. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind of voice that carries authority earned through experience, not through title. An intern handed her the instruments without thinking, muscle memory responding to the cadence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Rachel performed the field thoracotomy with the precision of someone who'd done it in a tent under mortar fire with nothing but field light and surgical instinct. Her hands moved with terrifying fluid precision as she opened his chest cavity, her fingers finding the heart through layers of muscle and blood. She applied direct cardiac compression, her movements those of apex predators, economical, deadly, exact. The colonel's heart began beating again, the monitor finding its rhythm before Rachel's hands even found their final position. Sinus rhythm. 104 beats per minute. The blood pressure climbing, 70/40, then 85/50, then 102/62. When the trauma team regained motion, they moved around her like water around a stone, anticipating her needs, responding to her instructions. She didn't have to ask for anything twice. After 7 minutes, the colonel was stabilized, his bleeding controlled, his vitals trending stable. Rachel stepped back from the patient, her scrubs painted red from elbow to wrist, her hand steady despite the adrenaline still moving through her bloodstream like electricity. Dr. Ashford arrived 60 seconds later, his face purpling as he watched this temp nurse, this disposable, blacklist-worthy temp nurse, elbow deep in a patient's thorax cavity. His eyes met Rachel's across the trauma bay, and for the first time, she saw something other than contempt in his expression. She saw fear. She saw the moment he realized he'd miscalculated, that the file he'd built on her didn't match the woman standing in front of him covered in another person's blood. The colonel was moved to the ICU, unconscious but alive. His blood pressure stable. His oxygenation excellent. His prognosis suddenly something measured in years instead of hours. Rachel disappeared to the locker room without a word, watching the blood spiral down the shower drain like rust running from old metal. She scrubbed her hands with surgical precision, her nails leaving crescents in the soap. When she returned to the unit, no one said anything to her. No one ordered her back to bedpan duty. No one mentioned the field thoracotomy or the command voice or the fact that every person in that trauma bay had recognized the presence of someone who'd been forged in a fire that civilian medicine only read about in journals. She was restocking the supply room when she realized what she'd lost. She pulled her hand to her chest instinctively, feeling for the chain around her neck. The dog tag, the single dog tag on the broken chain that she'd worn beneath her scrubs for 2 years, the one physical object that proved she wasn't a ghost, was gone. It must have caught on something when she was performing the thoracotomy, must have slipped from her neck and fallen away. Rachel's hands went still. She closed her eyes and calculated the probability that it had landed somewhere it could be found. Somewhere someone would see it. Somewhere the truth could no longer stay buried. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 11:24 a.m., and the trauma alert came through like a starting gun, severed femoral artery, training accident at Camp Lesan, 23-year-old Green Beret colonel with a tourniquet that had stopped the bleeding but not the clock. Rachel was restocking the suture cart when she heard the rotor wash echo through the corridors, that particular rhythm that meant someone's life was already measured in minutes. The ER team assembled with the mechanical precision of people who'd done this 100 times, not fast enough, but practiced. Dr. Ashford stood at the trauma bay entrance, already present, already positioned, watching the stretcher roll in with the particular intensity of a man who knew what was coming and had already decided how to shape it. The colonel hit the bay like a breaking wave, his left leg wrapped in field dressing that had turned dark crimson in the humidity, sweat pooling at his collarbone despite the air conditioning that made the tile floors cold as a morgue. His eyes were fixed and alert in the way of soldiers who'd been trained to function in the next 3 seconds instead of worrying about the hour after that. Rachel moved closer to the trauma bay's entrance, watching the attending physicians arrange themselves around the bed with the confidence of men who'd never once doubted they were the smartest people in the room. Dr. Ashford stood beside the colonel's head, one hand already reaching for the intubation kit, his voice carrying the weight of authority like a man who'd learned early that volume could substitute for competence. "Start 2 large bore lines," Dr. Ashford ordered, his tone clipped and certain. One of the nurses fumbled with the 4 setup, her hands moving but her eyes uncertain. The colonel's blood pressure had already begun dropping, 128/71, then 120/68, the numbers falling like a stone into deep water. Rachel watched the monitor screen and felt something ancient and precise click into place behind her ribs, the part of her that had spent 2 years in field stations where the next 3 minutes determined if a soldier walked out or came out in a bag. "Move," she said. It wasn't loud. It was a command voice, the kind that made the entire room compress into a single moment of clarity. Every head turned. The junior residents froze with their hands suspended in mid-motion. Dr. Ashford's face tightened into the expression of a man who'd suddenly been contradicted in his own operating theater, a landscape where such things did not happen. Rachel was already moving past them, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she grabbed the trauma pack and stepped into the space the colonel's body occupied. "Massive transfusion protocol. Activate it now. Type O negative, push the first 2 units while we're prepping. Blood pressure's still dropping, he's actively bleeding somewhere we can't see." Her voice had dropped an octave, the cadence military-clipped and precise, each word a coordinate on a map only she could read. The attending physicians watched her as if she'd suddenly begun speaking a language they'd studied but never actually heard spoken. The colonel's eyes locked onto hers for a single moment, recognition of something in her voice that matched something in his own bones, the particular frequency that one warrior uses to communicate with another when the world is collapsing. His blood pressure hit 89/52. "He's going into hemorrhagic shock," Rachel said, not to anyone specific but to the room as an entity. "Get me an anesthesiologist. We're taking him to OR. And someone get me a thoracotomy kit, we may need to clamp the aorta." Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his voice taking on the sharp edge of a man whose authority had just been questioned. "The attending physician makes those decisions. We don't know if..." "His femoral pulse is gone," Rachel interrupted, not looking at him, her eyes on the monitors where the oxygen saturation was dropping like a bird shot from the sky. 68, now 64. If we don't get him to surgery in the next 4 minutes, we're looking at full cardiac arrest before we even get him intubated. She was already moving, the stretcher wheel squeaking against the tile as she pushed him toward the OR doors. "Someone grab his chart. Someone tell me his name." The nurses moved with her like schools of fish responding to a current they could suddenly see. Dr. Ashford's voice called after her, "This is completely irregular," but the operating room doors were already swinging open, and Rachel was reading the monitors the way a musician reads a score, each number a note in a composition that would either resolve into survival or descend into silence. The OR was cold, the kind of cold that comes from stainless steel and recirculated air and the particular absence of human warmth. Rachel had him on the operating table before the anesthesiologist could finish their pre-op briefing. The tourniquet came off, and for a moment the wound gushed, not a leak but a hemorrhage, as if all the red in his body had decided to introduce itself to the outside world at once. "I need the surgical kit." "The full thoracotomy setup," Rachel said, and her hands were already moving, the scalpel already in her grip before anyone could question whether she had the authority to hold one. The blade was cold and small and perfect. Her hands remembered things that her file said she'd never learned. The chest opened in a line from the sternum to the 5th intercostal space, the ribs spreading like a book, and there it was, the lung collapsed, the mediastinum compressed, the kind of catastrophic hemorrhage that existed only in the most violent seconds of combat. The attending physician stood frozen, their competence suddenly revealed as the particular uselessness it always was in the presence of actual expertise. They had read about thoracotomies. They had watched videos. They had discussed them in conferences where the lighting was good and the stakes were theoretical. Rachel had done one in a tent in Sangin with a soldier's blood running down her forearms and the sound of artillery fire rattling the fabric walls, and her body remembered, and her hands knew the mathematics of it. She found the descending aorta and clamped it with a satin sky clamp, and the bleeding stopped, and the colonel's oxygen saturation climbed, 64, now 71, now 78, the numbers rising like a heartbeat returning from the edge of silence. His blood pressure stabilized at 92/55, and the monitors began singing again instead of shrieking. "I need 4 units packed red cells running wide open," Rachel said, her voice still in that command register, that frequency that made people move without question. 2 units fresh frozen plasma. Get me a trauma surgeon if we have one in the building. We need to repair the aorta before we close, and I'm going to need someone who can do that better than I can. The senior attending finally stepped forward, his face the color of wet flour. Who are you?" Rachel didn't look up from the cavity she was working in, her hands making the precise movements of someone who'd done this before, who'd had a human chest open in front of her and 15 minutes to decide if the body on the table went back to its unit or to a flag-draped coffin. "Right now," she said quietly. "I'm the person keeping him alive." The surgery took 93 minutes. The trauma surgeon arrived at minute 17 and worked alongside her without comment, following her lead, watching the way her hands moved and understanding in that moment that he was not the expert in the room. The aorta was repaired. The lung was reinflated. The chest was closed with sutures that looked like they'd been placed by someone who'd done this 1,000 times and would probably do it 1,000 more, assuming the world didn't burn down first. The colonel's eyes opened in recovery at 4:22 p.m. His oxygen saturation was 96%. His blood pressure was 118/72. His heart rate was 88, steady as a metronome. The monitors beat their quiet rhythm, and Rachel stood at the bedside checking his vitals with the precision of someone who'd learned to read a human body the way other people read weather reports. His hand found hers, and his fingers closed around her wrist with the strength of someone who'd just been pulled back from the edge of somewhere dark. "What's your name?" he whispered. Rachel withdrew her hand gently, professionally, the way a nurse withdraws from a patient. "Just a nurse," she said. But his other hand was already reaching for the bedside table, where someone had placed a single dog tag on a broken chain, the one that had been in his pocket during the surgery, the one that had survived the knife and the blood and the particular chaos of trying to stay alive. His fingers closed around it, and his eyes found hers again. "Not a chance," he said. "Not a chance in hell." Dr. Ashford appeared in the recovery room doorway at 6:15 p.m., his jaw tight, his presence making the air pressure change the way it always did when something was about to shift. He looked at the colonel, still conscious, still stable, still alive in a way that defied the medical probabilities that Dr. Ashford had already begun calculating in his favor. "I'll take it from here," he said to Rachel, his voice carrying the particular venom of a man who'd just realized his calculations had been wrong. Rachel nodded once and stepped back, her hand still steady, her face still composed. She didn't know yet that the dog tag the colonel was holding was the only thing connecting her to herself, the only piece of evidence that Major Rachel Torres had ever existed outside a classified file in a vault she'd never see again. She didn't know yet that she'd just performed surgery without credentials, without authorization, without the permission of a system that had spent 2 years trying to erase her from every official record. She only knew that he was alive, and that mattered more than anything else, and that was enough. For now. Dr. Ashford moved through Sacred Heart's surgical corridors with calculated precision. The attending physicians who'd witnessed Rachel's performance during the colonel's emergency, the ones who'd frozen while her hands moved with command authority, were reassigned within hours. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Patel, found himself transferred to pediatric surgery in the basement. The anesthesiologist was moved to the evening shift in a different wing entirely. The resident who'd actually watched Rachel perform a field thoracotomy was reassigned to rural clinic rotation an hour outside Jacksonville, effective immediately. Each transfer was buried in routine administrative shuffling. No explanations. No complaints honored. By 11 a.m. that morning, every witness had been scattered across different departments, different floors, different schedules. The message was clear: what you saw didn't happen. Forget it. Rachel noticed the absence of faces during her next shift. She didn't ask questions. Asking questions meant drawing attention, and attention was something she'd spent 2 years learning to avoid. The hospital's schedule algorithm mysteriously malfunctioned on Monday, somehow erasing her access to the colonel's recovery ward. When she checked the printed roster, her name appeared on 3 consecutive rotations in the ER observation unit, a basement room where she'd monitor a bank of screens showing patient vitals from a distance, her hands never touching anyone. The colonel's room was on the 3rd floor. The distance might as well have been miles. She was pushing a supply cart through the 2nd floor hallway when she overheard Ashford on his phone outside the administrator's office, voice pitched low but venomous. "No, she's not licensed for advanced procedures." "Yes, I'm certain." "Check her credentials again." "She performed a thoracotomy, yes, a surgical airway, not just an emergency procedure." "I have concerns about scope creep." "I have concerns about everything." A pause. His voice dropped further. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm documenting facts. The board should know she's a liability." The call ended. Rachel kept pushing the cart. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She counted her footsteps instead: 1, 2, 3, 4, the squeaking wheels marking her progress down the hallway like a ticking clock. The hospital board received Ashford's correspondence on Tuesday morning. A carefully worded memo questioning Rachel's qualifications. A detailed report about the medication discrepancies in the pharmacy logs, somehow framing her discovery of them as suspicious rather than diligent. Documentation of her unauthorized access to restricted files. He'd even included a note suggesting that her performance during the colonel's emergency might constitute practicing medicine without a license. The board chair had called an emergency credentialing review. Ashford had made certain the decision was foregone. He'd called in favors. He'd spoken to the hospital's legal team. He'd ensured that the hospital couldn't risk liability by keeping her employed, couldn't risk federal questions about credential verification, couldn't afford to have anyone digging too deeply into why a temporary nurse with fresh credentials had the clinical knowledge of a surgeon. The termination letter arrived at 4:51 p.m. on Wednesday, 48 hours after the colonel was transferred to Walter Reed under military convoy. No ceremony. No explanation beyond what the legal department had written in careful, indemnifying language. Reduction in temporary staffing needs. Credential discrepancies requiring further investigation. Scope of practice concerns. Effective immediately. She was escorted from the building by security at 5:15 p.m., her temporary badge deactivated at the door. The guard didn't make eye contact. Rachel sat in her car in the parking garage for 45 minutes without moving. Level 4, Space 47, the same spot she'd used for 3 weeks. Engine dead. Forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Her hands gripped it so hard her knuckles went white, then red, then white again. The concrete ceiling above her was cracked in 3 places, water stains spreading like maps of territory she'd never see again. A fluorescent light flickered directly above her car, on, off, like Morse code spelling out a message she didn't want to read. 2 years of keeping her head down. 2 years of answering to temp, of accepting insults without response, of walking past opportunities to help because helping meant attention and attention meant questions and questions meant exposure. She'd survived Sangin by making herself small. She'd survived Sacred Heart the same way. And it hadn't mattered. It had never mattered. Dr. Ashford had decided to destroy her the moment he understood what she was, and no amount of invisibility, no amount of compliance, no amount of quiet competence was going to stop him from doing it. Her breath fogged the windshield. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. The parking garage smelled like motor oil and stale concrete. Somewhere above her, the hospital continued its evening rhythm, shift change, dinner carts, the distant sound of overhead pages. She was no longer part of that world. She'd been erased from it as thoroughly as the Pentagon had erased her from every official database when Sangin was buried. The walls she'd built since Afghanistan, the ones that had held through every humiliation, every threat, every public dressing down, cracked somewhere around the 40-minute mark. Not visibly. Not audibly. But internally, something fractured. She'd been ordered to disappear. She'd done it perfectly. And they'd fired her anyway. 52 minutes. Her throat was tight. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't crying, she'd learned not to cry years ago, but the pressure behind her sternum was becoming difficult to breathe around. The colonel was gone. The witnesses had been scattered. The job was gone. In 48 hours, she'd lost everything again. This was what happened when you saved people. This was the cost of not following orders to stay invisible. The first sound came through the concrete walls as a distant hum. Then a pulse. Then unmistakably a rhythmic thump that made her lift her head from the steering wheel. Rotor blades. Growing louder. The sound echoed through the parking structure like the pulse of some mechanical heartbeat, and she knew immediately what it meant. Military didn't show up unless someone had triggered something. Military didn't arrive at civilian hospitals unless someone important had made a call. She watched through her cracked windshield as a Black Hawk helicopter emerged above the parking garage entrance, banking hard toward the hospital rooftop. The fuselage was dark tactical gray. The designation on the side read 160th SAR, Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Night Stalkers. The kind of unit that didn't show up for routine medical transfers. The kind of unit that showed up when classified things needed to be handled. The Black Hawk touched down on the hospital rooftop with a precision that suggested combat experience. She could see figures in uniform emerging from the side doors, at least 3 soldiers, maybe more, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people trained to operate under fire. Her heart had stopped somewhere between the moment the helicopter appeared and the moment it touched down. She couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but watch as her entire reconstruction of invisibility collapsed around her in the sound of military-grade rotors cutting through a Jacksonville evening. The fluorescent light above her car flickered again, and then, in the silence that followed, everything changed. She heard boots on concrete. Voices at the elevator. The sound of a radio frequency being keyed. And she understood, with absolute certainty, that whatever happened next would determine whether the last 2 years of hiding had meant anything at all. The thump of rotor blades cut through the concrete parking structure like an approaching storm. Rachel sat motionless in her car, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, the termination letter still clutched in her lap. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The sound grew louder, closer, the rhythm becoming a physical thing that seemed to shake the steel beams themselves. A Black Hawk helicopter. Not a medical transport. Not a routine flight. The kind of aircraft that only appeared when orders came from people 3 pay grades above everyone else in the room. She lifted her head slowly. The rotor wash vibrated the windows of her sedan. The sound moved upward, the mechanical thunder climbing toward the hospital's rooftop helipad, and something in Rachel's chest tightened with the recognition of what that arrival meant. The dog tag. The colonel. Walter Reed. He'd survived. Upstairs, in the administrator's office on the 4th floor, a man in combat fatigues moved with the kind of purposeful precision that made civilian space seem too small for him. Captain Derek Holloway, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse, walked past the hospital administrator as if he wasn't there. His boots hit the polished floor like a metronome, each step a reminder that authority wasn't a tie or a letterhead. Authority was what happened when the Pentagon decided you were important enough to send military transport. "Where is Major Rachel Torres?" Holloway said. "Not a question. Call sign Reaper. Now." The administrator's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Behind him, rolling into the office in a wheelchair with 4 lines still trailing from his forearm, Colonel James Mercer made eye contact with the young administrator and held it until the man looked away. The colonel's face was still pale, still marked by the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have killed him, but his hand was steady as he raised it to show what he was holding. A single dog tag on a broken chain. "This nurse saved my life," the colonel said, his voice the quiet rasp of someone who'd spent 2 days intubated. "She left this in my room. I want to know why she's not walking these halls anymore." Holloway opened a classified file folder. The kind with the red security markings. The kind that wasn't supposed to exist in a civilian hospital. He began to read, and each word seemed to drain more color from the administrator's face. Silver Star. Operation Sangin, 2019. Citation, for extraordinary heroism in direct contact with enemy forces while assigned to a forward surgical team in Helmand Province. Major Torres maintained surgical operations under sustained mortar fire, performing emergency thoracotomies in a field hospital with no anesthesia for 18 consecutive hours. 12 soldiers returned to full duty as a direct result of her intervention. The administrator swallowed. His hands were shaking now. Purple Heart, Holloway continued. 2019, Purple Heart, 2020. He turned the page. Joint Service Commendation Medal. Citation, for saving 12 lives during a field hospital siege that officially never happened. For maintaining classified protocols while evacuating wounded personnel under conditions that would have justified abandonment of duty. The colonel leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the wheelchair arms with the kind of controlled force that came from military training. "This nurse is a decorated major who has more combat saves than your entire surgical staff combined. And she just added my name to that list." The silence in the office was absolute. The kind of silence that happened when someone realized they'd been standing next to a legend and trying to destroy her. Dr. Ashford, watching this unfold from the hallway where a security guard had quietly positioned him, felt his face drain of blood. Not because Rachel had been a nurse. Not because she'd saved lives. But because her classified records, now being read aloud in front of federal investigators, contained a direct notation about the medication discrepancies she'd discovered. The same discrepancies he'd been diverting for 18 months. The same ones he'd threatened to stay quiet about. The same ones that were, right now, being cross-referenced by 2 Department of Defense auditors who'd arrived that morning specifically to investigate how a nurse with a broken resume had accessed restricted pharmacy files without authorization. The investigation unfolded with the efficiency of a military operation. Within 4 hours, DEA agents had seized Dr. Ashford's office computers. Within 8 hours, his personal prescription records were being logged as evidence. Within 24 hours, the pattern was clear: 18 months of opioid diversion. Fentanyl patches listed as wasted. Morphine bottles marked as contaminated and destroyed. Dilaudid documented as discarded. All of it signed off by a doctor with the authority to make the discrepancies disappear into routine hospital waste protocols. 18 months. Over 800 doses of controlled narcotics. A street value approaching $200,000. Dr. Ashford had been selling them to a distributor in Miami. The same distributor who'd been caught in a DEA raid 2 weeks earlier, whose records implicated physicians, pharmacists, and hospital administrators across 3 states. Rachel's single access to the restricted pharmacy database, an accident from her first week, a momentary curiosity about a notation she didn't understand, had been the thread. Ashford's campaign to destroy her, intended to force her out quietly before she asked more questions, had instead triggered a Dodd review that pulled the classified file that led to the federal audit that uncovered everything. The Florida Medical Board suspended him within 6 hours of the evidence presentation. Federal charges were filed within 72 hours. His attorney negotiated a plea deal before the week ended: 3 years probation, $100,000 in restitution, and the permanent revocation of his medical license. Rachel returned to Sacred Heart the following Monday wearing her regular scrubs, reinstated with back pay, her records officially still erased but her presence no longer questioned. The colonel remained in the ICU for another week, and on his last day before transfer to Walter Reed, she entered his room during the shift change. They were alone for exactly 3 minutes. "Thank you," he said. Simple. Direct. The way military people spoke when words needed to carry the weight of gratitude that couldn't be verbalized without breaking. I was doing my job, Rachel replied. Her voice hadn't changed. Her composure was intact. But the dog tag around her neck caught the light as she turned slightly. Why didn't you defend yourself? Against Ashford? Against any of it? I was ordered to stay hidden, she said quietly. Surfacing would have endangered the others from Sangin. The soldiers I saved. Their families. The protocol was absolute. She paused. But you kept bleeding. And protocols don't matter if someone's dying in front of you. The colonel nodded slowly. The army doesn't deserve you. But those 12 soldiers you saved do. And so do I. He was transferred to Walter Reed that afternoon. Rachel watched the ambulance leave from the ICU window, then returned to her patients. The dog tag hung beneath her scrubs again, the chain finally repaired, and she didn't take it off for a single shift. 6 months passed like the turning of seasons, each day the same structure but different weight. Rachel worked full-time at Sacred Heart now, no longer temporary, her name on the roster. She earned promotions on merit. She trained new nurses with the kind of quiet authority that made them listen before they understood why they should. She never spoke about Sangin. She never mentioned the dog tag. But when new staff asked about the scar tissue on her hands, she'd look at them directly and say, "Pain is information. You learn to listen to it." Then came the call from the Pentagon. Formal. Official. An invitation to a ceremony on a date 6 months out. Dress blues required. Family welcome. Rachel almost declined. The instinct to remain hidden, to stay invisible, was still there, still strong. But the colonel's voice on the phone was insistent. You earned this. The army owes you this. And someone needs to see you step out of the shadows. The ceremony took place in a conference room 3 levels below the Pentagon's main corridor, in spaces most civilians would never know existed. The room held 43 people. 3 of them were soldiers Rachel had saved in Sangin. She recognized them by the way they stood, by the precise angle of their posture, by the fact that they'd traveled to this room specifically to watch her receive what was owed. Colonel Mercer, fully recovered now, standing without assistance, stepped forward in his Class A uniform. He was holding a small box. Inside were the rank insignia for Lieutenant Colonel. The promotion that had been signed but never conferred. The advancement that had been buried with everything else. Major Rachel Torres, he said, and the formality of the full name in that room meant everything. For extraordinary heroism, extraordinary service, and extraordinary courage under conditions that can never be fully disclosed, the Department of Defense recognizes your promotion to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, effective 2 years retroactive. He pinned the insignia carefully, one on each collar, his hand steady. The dog tag caught the light as he stepped back and saluted. The room erupted in applause. The 3 soldiers she'd saved were crying. Rachel stood perfectly still, her face calm, her jaw tight, her hands at her sides. The mask held. But inside, somewhere in the space where she'd been ordered to stay invisible, something finally exhaled. A reporter approached her afterward. Microphone. Camera. The question was automatic. What's next for you, Lieutenant Colonel Torres? Rachel looked directly into the lens. Her voice was the same voice that had commanded an ER to stillness, that had barked orders while her hands worked to save a colonel's life, that had never once broken under deliberate humiliation. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She returned to Sacred Heart the following week. She'd requested the same ICU rotation, the same shifts, the same quiet position where most people forgot to see her. Except now she worked under her real name. Now when nurses glanced at her, they understood there was something more. Now when patients coded, they asked for her specifically. And now, when new staff members noticed the dog tag beneath her scrubs, when they asked what it meant, she'd smile slightly and say, "It's a reminder that some things are worth surfacing for." Subscribe to this channel to watch more stories of hidden strength and overlooked heroism. Like this video if you believe Rachel's story deserves to be told. Comment below, Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you have done in her position? Thank you for watching.